Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Steve Fleming. I'm Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience here at UCL. Welcome to today's session. We're delighted to have two fantastic speakers on very exciting topics today. So both Professor Anna Cox and Professor Parashkev Nachev are going to be giving two talks. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers before their talk and then hand over to them. We're going to run the talks back to back, and then there'll be time for Q&A sessions at the end. So to introduce our first speaker, Anna Cox is a Professor of Human-Computer Interaction in the UCL Interaction Centre, known as UCLIC, in the Division of Psychology and Language Sciences, and she's also Vice Dean for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in the Faculty of Brain Sciences. So Anna was awarded her PhD from the University of Hertfordshire in 2002 before becoming a lecturer in the Computer Science Department there, and then moved to UCL in 2004. She was promoted to full professor in 2017 and was deputy director of UCLIC between 2009 and 2017. And Anna has also been a specialist advisor to the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee at the House of Commons for their 2019 inquiry into immersive and addictive technologies. So we're delighted to have you today, Anna, to give us the first presentation. So I will hand over to you to share your screen, and then I'll take over at the end to introduce Parashkev. You're on mute, Anna.
Okay, can you see my slides as well?
We can indeed.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much for the introduction. As Steve said, I'm a Professor of Human-Computer Interaction, and that means that I investigate the interactions between people and the design of digital technologies and how the design of the technologies impacts user experience. So how it impacts what you really feel about a technology. So the reason why, you might hate email or love Instagram, whatever it is. So one of the goals of my research is to try to help us to understand how to make technologies work really well for people, so that they do just what we want. And today I want to tell you about a project in which we explored why a particular class of digital mental health app hasn't been as successful as we might have hoped it would be. And in doing that, illustrate an opportunity for AI to be more integrated into these apps, and then and why I think that would have a really positive impact. And at the same time, to persuade you of the value of HCI when designing these apps. So the project I'm going to tell you about was conducted with Stephen Schuler from the University of California, Irvine, Andreas Velasquez, who is now at University College Dublin, and Gavin Doherty from Trinity College Dublin. And we looked at how to enhance the efficacy of digital mental health apps for anxiety. So as I'm sure many of you know, anxiety disorders are one of the most common forms of mental illness globally, affecting millions of people and impacting their day-to-day lives in many ways. But despite the prevalence of these disorders, many people lack access to effective treatment due to cost, availability, or stigma associated with seeking help. And because of these, we can see how mobile digital apps might be really brilliant, because they would be cheaper to deliver than having a person involved in the treatment. They can be always available and available anywhere. And if stigma is something that might be preventing someone from seeking help, this would give them access to something in a way that might be easier for them to cope with, or it might be just facilitate accessibility. So it's perhaps no response then that so many digital apps have been created with the hope that they would fill this gap. And I think what is really kind of disappointing, though, is that despite the potential benefits of these technologies, the majority of them fail to gain traction. So the attrition rates of people using them are really high, and finding anyone who has sustained use of them is really, really rare. So in this talk, I'm going to cover work that was done in this project, and we'll start by trying to understand why people don't stick with using these apps, despite the fact that they could be of help to them. We'll also look at what the literature tells us about the use of AI in digital mental health apps as a way to see if that gives us some clues as to perhaps why they haven't been successful. And finally, take a look at some of these apps themselves, focusing on the functionality and the engagement features. And so I'm going to tell you about all of those 3 separate studies. So first of all, why don't people stick with these? Well, if we're trying to design for engagement, so whatever type of technology it is that we're trying to create, we need to think about what people really want. So what is really driving their desire for this, to use this app, not just how it might be effective, but how we hook them in at the first place and how we keep them using it. So we often try to look at the things that stop them from using it, so the barriers. And doing these kinds of studies in terms of trying to understand what drives use and what prevents use can give us a really good understanding of people's self-management practices with these apps, and about how different aspects of the design of an app might affect user adoption and sustained use. So if you visit any app store, you will see hundreds and sometimes thousands of reviews provided by users of smartphone apps. And we found that they can be a really rich source of data. So in this paper, we describe a mixed method study where we combined a review of those app reviews, so a thematic analysis of those app reviews, together with a thematic analysis of semi-structured interviews with people who had actually used some apps. So we got to talk to some people as well. So the first part of that, we reviewed 600 App Store reviews that covered 5 of the most popular mobile apps. And the reason why we thought that was a sensible pool to choose from is that most people don't scroll down and choose something that's not at the top of the list. They tend to choose the ones that are the most popular and appear at the top of the list. And we also limited our search to apps that integrated CBT and had provided some evidence of effectiveness for anxiety management. So the reviews covered the topics relating to the whole lifespan of using the app. So on the slide, you can see that blue bar at the top, showing that, we found information about how people's experience when downloading it, their initial interactions, what kind of happened afterwards, and then even about sustained use. So we had quite a broad spectrum of types of user, I suppose. But you can see here that in green, we have some of their reasons for engaging. So why did they want to choose these apps? So they like the fact that they're easy to access, that they can be relatively cheap. They like apps that are well designed and can be used anywhere and at any time. But you can see that there's a long list of barriers here that prevent sustained use. And I think some of the important reasons are that these apps were often much more difficult to use than people expected. Some of them were just too annoying, offering irrelevant content or unsolicited messages, like lots of notifications. Or they just didn't offer what the user was really looking for in terms of peer support or connections to therapists, and they kind of generally failed to meet their needs. One important barrier around cost was that whilst many users were initially willing to try an app when it's free, they become quite hesitant when they're faced with a subscription fee. And this it becomes a really big problem if they've tried the free version and then they only get like a week's trial, but a week isn't really long enough for you to have experienced a really positive impact. And so then, that acts as a barrier and they drop out. So looking at these app reviews provided us with like some really good insights as to what might be going on here and some of the important factors. But I think it's important to recognize that reviews only contain information that users think is important and that they think is important to share with other people that might download this app. And so there might be limitations to the kinds of things that they might write about. So that was our primary motivation for why we want to interview users as well. So we conducted interviews with 15 people who used mobile apps for anxiety management to try to get a more in-depth perspective. And you can see here that, again, we get information across the whole lifespan of people using these apps. We see what they value and things that they don't like, and also just other things that they suggested could be useful. So I think one of the key issues that came up for us was the lack of content diversity and the fact they found that the content became quite repetitive after a while and that diminished their interest and engagement. And I think coupled with this, there's this idea of insufficient customization and personalization. So people have really diverse needs based on their specific symptoms or triggers and preferences. And when they can't make the app work for them, given their particular context, we know from interaction with lots of different types of technology that those are the sorts of things that means engagement drops significantly. So this really highlighted for us the importance of thinking about how could these technologies provide a more personalized experience. And I think this is where AI could play a really important role. So what could AI offer that might improve engagement? So when we think about this, I think if we think about how technology has changed over the past 15, 20 years, we've seen the introduction of smartphones, and that's created a whole world of things that we can do. And as those phones have advanced, we've been able to do more and more things. So they have more and more sensors in them. They can connect to all sorts of other wearable technologies. And this has really opened up a space of new, exciting things that are possible. And I think one of the most sophisticated visions for the future of digital health has been this concept of ecologically momentary interventions. So the idea that we might be able to assess people either like right in the moment, either from data that comes from sensors that they're wearing or on their phone, or data that they're inputting themselves, and then deliver based on that data that we've collected and analysed, deliver an intervention right in the moment. So these are often referred to as just-in-time interventions. And they offer a really kind of exciting possibility and a way to really make the interaction and the experience personalised. So in this paper, we report a scoping review of the literature looking at ecological momentary interventions over the last decade. And we explore like how they're defined, what they comprise of in practice, and how they compare to the original vision for them that's been articulated in the literature. And I think the one thing that I want to kind of pull out from those findings is that when we looked at the literature, we saw that there were lots of examples of where these interventions have been explored in terms of delivering for anxiety and substance disorders, but there are lots of other spaces where they haven't been considered at all. And this seems like a real gap. Like I think they're kind of underutilized. And maybe that's because they're very difficult to implement, or people just haven't thought about how they might provide us with real opportunities. So I think this is where I really see an opportunity for AI to come in and impact a broader set of mental health conditions by providing more bespoke and tailored interventions. So going back to our anxiety apps, we wanted to have a look and see, well, what are the EMIs being used in this context, and what's the opportunity and the reality also for seeing how tailoring and personalization is built into these apps themselves. So we decided to take a look at the apps. So in this study, we explore the functionality and engagement features of commercially available mobile apps for anxiety management. And we looked at content delivery, engagement, and tailoring features. So in that study I just referred to, that literature review study, we were able to pull out of there what the literature tells us should be in these sorts of apps and the kinds of functionality that has been shown in research to be really effective. And what we're looking for here is to see, can we find evidence of the research having impacted the design of the things that are commercially available? So we conducted a systematic search for the apps, and we decided to look for apps that were described as being based on CBT, that appeared in both Android and iPhone markets. And we originally had 597 apps, but once we applied our inclusion criteria, we ended up with 36 that were specifically using CBT for anxiety-related disorders. So to examine them, we kind of used our literature review to provide us with guidance for what we should be looking for, and then we extracted features by using the apps, so actually using them to try to understand what's there, what functionality is there. So in terms of what we found, looking first at content delivery, so we've got 36 apps that we looked at. And here you can see how many of those apps had different types of functionality in terms of what kind of content they were trying to deliver. So 6 of them used 1 or more treatment programs, 21 delivered psychoeducation, and so on. So whilst they have, there's quite a spread in terms of the types of content they're delivering, we can see that they're really not offering the kind of depth or intensity of therapy that might be necessary for severe anxiety cases. And I think it's worth reflecting on the extent to which an individual would be able to easily choose the app that's right for them, given that there's so much variation in terms of what they really offer. Thinking about engagement then, so these are features that would be designed to keep you engaged with using the app, so engage with the therapy over a period of time, and kind of avoiding that drop off that we see with so many digital technologies. So the vast majority of them had visualization of data, so you could explore your own data and reflect upon it. Some of them use things like gamification in terms of like points and badges. Some enabled you to connect with other people, whether they're healthcare experts. So that could be an opportunity to connect directly with an expert, or to share your data with your therapist, or to engage with others for peer support. And about half of them had crisis support, so could direct someone to emergency help. So in terms of tailoring, in terms of like really thinking about how do you make these technologies deliver the right thing to the right person in the right moment, we can see that there's a range of different techniques that are used in terms of gathering data that might be able to drive that kind of tailoring for an AI system, so be fed into an algorithm. So some of them used screening during onboarding in order to try to diagnose a particular psychological disorder, or use that kind of onboarding to educate users about the functionality that was in the app so that they could choose themselves which things they thought were appropriate. But in that situation, it's really down to the user to determine what they think might work for them. Some of them enabled people to provide data themselves, so explicitly through things like journaling or tracking feelings and mood and so on. And only one of them used physiological sensing, so any kind of, like automatically gathered data. So I think one of the things that we noticed was that these apps don't really have good coverage in terms of the kinds of data that could be used to tailor treatment. And this really seems like a critical gap in the landscape in the design of these things. So the apps in general offer a kind of one-size-fits-all approach with very limited options for the user to tailor or personalize their experience. And I think this is such a shame, but at the same time is an exciting opportunity, because now we know this gap is here, people could start to fill it, and really get creative about thinking about what are the opportunities to gather this data in different ways, either through automatic sensing and a combination perhaps of that with user-generated data, so that we have something that really works for people. So just to summarize that then, the three questions that I set out at the beginning: why is it that people don't stick with these apps? Well, they just don't live up to their expectations. They don't offer what they wanted when they went in, when they decided to download it. What could AI offer that might improve engagement? I really think there's an exciting opportunity for personalization of treatment, if we work out the best ways to do that. And how do the existing mental health apps try to ensure engagement? Well, there's a real lack of these sort of EMIs to deliver the tailored interventions, and actually a real lack of consideration of the user in terms of ensuring that they can personalize their experience. So I will just leave you with the idea that if you build it, they will come, but only if you build what they really, really want.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anna. And yeah, as I said before, the online environment means that we don't get the usual round of applause to punctuate the talks, but people are giving virtual rounds of applause, which is excellent to see. So what we'll do is we'll move straight on. I did put a message in the chat to say that if people do have questions, then do post them in the chat as you're thinking of them, and there'll also be the opportunity for a live Q&A at the end for both Anna and Parashkev. So don't forget your questions, save them up or write them in the chat. But we will move straight on. So our next speaker in today's session is Parashkev Nachev. He's a clinician and neuroscientist. He's a professor of neurology in the Department of Brain Repair and Rehabilitation at UCL. He has interest in combining machine learning and medicine to understand the complexity of the human brain. So in his own words, his research program is guided by the widely resisted idea that the human brain is too complex to be rendered either intelligible or actionable by the parsimonious low-dimensional models dominant in the field. So we're excited to have you give our next talk, Parashkev, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. Right, I hope you can all see that. So, one of the challenges of, can you all see that? Yeah. Oh, now I can't hear you, Steve.
Okay, now we can see that. Sorry, it was still in the small screen mode, but now it's full screen.
Right, hang on, it's crashing again. Apologies. Let me just try this once more. I think there's some issue here. Okay, let me try it again. Right. Better now?
It's still in small screen, but maybe it's just loading up for us. It's gone. We lost it. You're just muted now, Parashkev.
Yes, many apologies. I think there's some issue with my Zoom. Let me see if I can change.
Well, perhaps while you just try and figure that out, maybe we could take one question for Anna.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, okay, great. So Anna, there's a question in the chat asking, are you aware of any existing projects using AI for mental health in the way you described towards the end there?
Well, I think there's a lot, because we have to start off by defining what do we mean by AI, and what kind. It's used in so many different contexts, right? And I think we're all really aware right now of AI in LLMs, and how we can play around with that for different purposes, and there have been lots of people who've been exploring using LLMs as therapists in kind of mental health contexts, and people talking about the concerns they have with that. But I think, AI it's been around for a long time, and it's used in so many different applications. So anything that tries to do any kind of tailoring or pattern recognition. There are also some really interesting studies being done, looking at how we might be able to gather data from people's interactions with everyday technologies, like digital games, and looking at well, could we use that kind of information to indicate when someone might be at heightened risk of a particular mental health condition. So I think there's lots of exciting things to look at, and Google is probably your friend to answer that question.
All right, brilliant. How are you getting on,
I think, let me try again. I might have to keep it minimized, I'm afraid, but I hope that doesn't ruin the experience.
Yeah, we saw it fine this is absolutely fine. If that was working, let's go with that.
I think we might have to go with that.
Sure.
Right.
Okay.
So, so one of the challenges of presenting a talk on artificial intelligence is that it tends to be out of date by the time you've written the slides. So rather than talking about specific models, specific systems, specific problems, what I would like to do is outline some of the general characteristics of, on the one hand, the problem and the space of possible solutions that we might be able to provide, because I think it's important to be absolutely clear about the bigger picture here. Now, I always find it helpful to reflect on what it is that we are actually trying to do in medicine. And the fact is that the objective of medicine has remained unchanged since its very inception. What we have is a patient, and we have a clinician, a set of clinicians. And our objective is to achieve the best possible health for the patient in front of us. Here's an inscription well known from 150 BC. You might notice the patient here is standing while the doctor is sitting down. Now the locations, I hope, are generally speaking changed, but the fundamental form of the relationship is the same. It's all about the individual patient in front of us. So why is it so difficult to come up with the right decision for an individual patient? Well, one answer is because the representations that we have of patients are by their very nature, noisy, biased, and incomplete. Here I represent the idea of what we know about a patient as an image, for example, a scan of someone's body. But of course, this applies not just to structural features, but also behavioral and psychological ones. And we can think of our representation as being not the complete picture that I'm showing here on the left, but a piecemeal, poorly sampled set of limited perspectives from which we try to retrieve the underlying full picture. And that, of course, is going to be immensely challenging. Now, one of the things that we always seek is precision, to have the most detailed specification of the system in front of us. In fact, people speak of precision medicine. We need to reflect on what exactly precision really means. The most obvious way of thinking about it is in terms of the resolution of the data that you gather. Here again, exemplified with an image, but it's actually true of anything that we measure. We might have a coarsely sampled picture, or we might have something very fine. But precision is more than that. Each individual has a multiplicity of aspects by which they can be described. And again, one can illustrate it with images by talking about different spectra. So here we might have a very high resolution image, but it might be inadequate in, for example, providing color information. And the same thing applies to other forms of description of a human being. But most importantly, there is no reason to assume that the underlying patterns that we reveal with our investigations are homogeneous. That is to say that each individual patient is essentially variation on what might be a kind of Platonic ideal, and that variation is more or less random. So it may well be that the population is highly heterogeneous. So rather than seeing a set of examples from what is a canonical unified center of variation, we have a multiplicity of different clusters. And what I wish to argue is that heterogeneity is actually the principal problem we have in describing the brain, definitely in describing behavior, but also in understanding human beings in general. You might say, well, it's easy to advance an argument, but what about empirical data? Well, here's some analyses that are based on the analysis of individuals that have been imaged. If we take a set of several thousand patients on whom we have MRI scans of the brain, and we attempt to do something very simple, predict their age, we find that our ability to do this is highly sensitive to the number of features that we use to describe them, but also the number of training data points, essentially how many of these images we're using in order to produce a solution. And in this plot here, I'm showing the error of the estimate of someone's age. And as you can see, the error falls as we add more patients and as we add more features, here, number of components from a PCAD composition. But critically, you end up with a comparatively low error only once you have thousands of training data points, and only when you have many, many more features that we usually use to describe our cohorts. So even if something such as age requires very rich data at large scale, then it's difficult to assume that this will not also be true of things that we're actually interested in, such as, for example, psychological therapies or outcomes. What about pathology? Well, here is an illustrative example from stroke. What we have done here is to take 1,300 or so lesions of patients with ischemic stroke and captured the variation in the anatomical patterns of damage into a two-dimensional space shown in the center, where individual lesions that are similar or far apart are clustered together or are separated. And you can see that rather than getting a single pattern from which everyone varies more or less randomly, we have characteristic clusters that when you project out to the actual appearance of the lesions conforms to what one might expect given the fundamental patterns of damage. So even something as comparatively simple as stroke, it is the consequence of occlusion of a vessel. This is ischemic stroke in particular. Even that has an extraordinarily rich structure when you look at the impact of the brain. And if this is rich, then it's overwhelmingly likely that other conditions will be rich too. So what are the consequences of ignoring this heterogeneity, saying, oh, well, as long as I have a model, I will be able to produce an objective quantification of a patient and motivate treatment on that basis? Well, let's here illustrate the consequences with a simulation. So at the top here, shown on the left, is a description, a hypothetical description of a set of patients based on 2 dimensions, where rather than the distribution being completely random, it is clustered, much along the lines of what I've shown you empirically so far. If we proceed, as evidence-based medicine typically does, to treat everyone as being random deviation from the average, ignoring the clusters, then the error for each individual patient, our focus, is going to be proportional to the distance from that global mean. Crucially, not only will our model therefore be inaccurate, it will also be inequitable, because the further away your cluster is from the mean, the more likely that for that subpopulation, the error will be high. So the only solution here is to try to understand the underlying complex rich distribution of these patterns, and then refer each individual to the centroid of their cluster. Then we not only achieve better fidelity overall, but we also achieve better equity, because there's now less variation across the field. So the demands of model fidelity and equity demand necessarily much more expressive, much richer representations of the patient population. Now you might say, well, this is all very good. You're talking about descriptions of rich characteristics across the population. But surely there has to be some kind of common mechanism. The presumption of interventions in medicine is that there is some sort of causal chain where we can intervene, modify a component, and therefore change the outcomes for everyone. Well, that, one might say, horological perspective on biological mechanisms need not be right. It could be that the mechanisms, particularly of the brain, are subserved not by a single causal path, but by multiple causal paths within what is therefore necessarily a distributed causal system, much in the same way as deep learning models at the moment find that they can produce solutions via a multiplicity of possible implementations or specifications of a particular model. And if that causality is complex, then it need not be easily determinable, and it certainly need not be homogeneous. These sorts of complex systems inevitably have to learn by minimizing the difference between input and output, just as deep learning models currently do. And what goes on within the interior of the system need not necessarily be easy for us to discern. This is because the same input-output transformation may have a very large number of different solutions, and those solutions can be actually individually unique, or they may vary across the populations. There's nothing here that compels biology to impose any kind of generalizable principles. We need to be ready to be able to model a heterogeneity of possible causal mechanisms. So how do we solve this? Well, we need to address the core problem, which is that the data from which we infer what goes on mechanistically and what we could potentially intervene in order to bring about a change of therapeutic benefit, is that we need to model a wide range of sources of variability. There is the natural biological, each patient different from another in normal biological terms. There is, of course, the pathological. These are deviations from normality that we wish to be able to treat. And then there is also the instrumental, the variability that is injected into the data by the instruments that we use to collect it. That is obvious when it comes to things like scanners, but it's also true with behavioral tests or behavioral systems of one kind or another. So what that task demands is a means of modeling all these sources of variation together, because we cannot a priori assume that they do not interact. In fact, it's very likely that they're complex interactions between biology, pathology, and instruments, particularly when the data is collected within the clinical stream. What this implies is not a model that finds some sort of decision boundary between, for example, patients that you might want to treat or not treat, but rather a model that learns the underlying distribution. And that is a generative model. It needs to be a highly expressive model, and therefore it tends to rely on deep learning architectures, and we speak of these as being deep generative models. Here's an example of how these models may represent a set of data. The top row shows its application to faces, and this is a particular type of deep generative model, a hierarchical variation autoencoder that represents a face in terms of different scales of variability. You can see this is the individual here on the far right, and then in the intermediate stages, we have representations that become more and more meany until we come to what appears to be the average for that particular subpopulation. And exactly the same thing can be done on brains, as shown here below. But what does that give us? Well, here's an example from a model that has learned multiple sequences. Again, these are volume images of the brain. And having learned different sequences, can now reconstruct a sequence that is missing. So it can absorb not just the biological and pathological variability of the data, but also the instrumental variability. And so differences in the sampling that might otherwise obscure effects that are relevant to treatment can now be accounted for. So this is the original image that you feed into the model. For example, it's able to impute a different sequence, a T1. This is a flare, this is a T1. And one can actually reconstruct then the flare via the T1. And one can compare how the original T1 and the imputed one differ and show that we've correctly learned what these different sequences are, how they show the brain a different light. Indeed, these models, by virtue of being generative, can dream, as it were, of the full space of possible brains. And of course, is the ideal. Any model is going to be an approximation, but they learn the space of possibility and one can sample within it. Here's the output of one of our models, and you can see that it dreams not of the same brain, but a wide diversity, capturing the full variety of appearances that we see both biologically, pathologically, and instrumental. More usefully, we can use a model of this kind in order to condition a particular sample so as to change its properties in a way that allows us to reveal effects at the subpopulation level. For example, we can take a relatively crude image and super resolve it, not just within its own modality, but multiple different modalities. Essentially reconstruct what the brain looks like underneath as seen through different sequences. We can change properties of the brain that may help us identify characteristics that would otherwise be camouflaged by difference in things like age and sex. So we can age, we change the sex of the brain. We can also take pathological regions within the brain and infer what the brain would have looked like before they were present. in effect, to targeted lesion erasure that preserves the individuality of the patient. In a sense, we're doing a kind of model-based time travel, and that's obviously helpful in being able to determine what could have been done differently and what could have potentially have affected the outcome in a particular patient before. And we can also use these models in order to derive causal maps of the relationships between possible areas of the brain and particular outcomes. And these models facilitate that because they give us an ability to represent the variability much more compactly, and therefore those sorts of causal models are less likely to violate their founding assumptions. And crucially, they allow us to represent populations in a way that can identify at the individual level who may respond to one treatment versus another. Essentially, to apply individualized treatment effect estimation, in particular to do this potentially from observational data. So now when we say our task is to select the right treatment for the right patient, we're not relying on intelligence that is merely applied to the average of the population. It is now focused on what is plausibly true of this specific patient in front of us. So we are, in effect, through these models, completing a full circle back to focusing on the individual patient in front of us via a system that may well be very complex, potentially too complex for anyone to understand. Previously, the brain of the clinician, now the interior of a very complex genetic model, but ultimately delivering at higher fidelity what we have always wanted, which is to come up with the best decision for each individual patient, regardless of their background, in the most equitable way possible. Thank you very much. I will stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Parashkev. So a virtual round of applause for Parashkev, please, as well. So if Anna and Parashkev, you can stay unmuted so you're ready to answer questions that come along for you. Please do, the audience, use the raise hand tool if you'd like to ask your question live. Alternatively, if you'd rather post it in the chat, then I can ask it on your behalf. There's a question in the chat for Anna. So the question is from Hotri, who's asking, do mental health apps improve anxiety for young children as well?
I guess I would say maybe. I think I don't recall when we've looked at the literature whether we found examples specifically for children. But I think one of the things that comes out of our research project is that there's a bit of a gap between what we might discover about the efficacy of an app in a study and what happens when it's deployed in the real world. So we know there are all sorts of other motivating factors that mean that people are more likely to comply with the protocol when they're taking part in a study, which can lead us to seeing that these things work under those kinds of conditions. But then when we try to adopt them in real life, it's just not as straightforward to get the benefits from them. So I think there are probably some. I just don't know. I wouldn't have them at the tip of my tongue to make any recommendations.
Great, thank you. While people are thinking of other questions, so I have a question for Parashkev. And on the end of your I found it very interesting what you were saying about treatment prediction at the end. And I was just wondering, coming at this from a perspective as a psychologist, cognitive neuroscientist, I'm wondering what role behavioral or psychological profiles play in entering into those treatment prediction models, and if if they don't, does that tell us something potentially quite deep and interesting about what is causal in terms of predicting treatment response?
Oh, I mean, I think you're right that we need to model everything, not just the brain, but also the behavior. And the examples that I gave very much on outcomes in stroke, where people currently employ very crude descriptions. Does the patient walk or do they not? As we enter the realm of the psychological, the cognitive, we would need to have much more detailed characterization of each patient. And the ideal would be that you have both the richness of the structural data and the richness of the cognitive behavioral data modeled jointly together. The challenge is going to be that if it's hard enough to assemble large data sets of imaging, then it's even harder to assemble large data sets both of imaging and cognition behavior. And that will require, I think, a very substantial change in the attitude that we have, and actually funders also have, towards research in this domain. I think we should be able to say to funders, look, I'm sorry, we need 10,000 patients where we have both imaging, very detailed imaging, and very detailed cognitive and behavioral assessment. That's what it needs. Yes, it's a £10 million project or £20 million project, whatever. But do you want this problem solved or not?
Great, thanks. Essie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I've got a question that somewhat follows from what you've said, Steve. So I'm also wondering to what extent we need in this model to account for the quality of evidence and weight it. So I can imagine that if you measure brain morphology, presuming that your scan is reasonably calibrated, you can get relatively accurate measures. But of course, we know that depending on whichever psychological measure you use, for instance, there is a much greater degree of measurement error. And then if you start incorporating things like past life events, for instance, and environmental risk that is not measured concurrently, then there is all sorts of subjective interpretation bias, which may be very meaningful for mental health risk, but it's still. So I'm wondering whether there needs to be sort of parallel work also in us getting some kind of estimates as to how much error weighting we need to do to these sorts of inputs. So if we have multi variable models, we may also, for the individual prediction, need to weight those predictions on the quality of evidence that you input to the model.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, as always, the more intelligence we inject into the model, including about the prior uncertainty of the signals, the better it's going to be. And I think what we all agreed on is that these models need more and more information, not less, which puts us on a direction of travel towards ever larger and larger models. And that's really the key point. I think the most striking revelation over the past year or so, of the age of ChatGPT and the rest, is that performance increases as you increase model size, way beyond the point at which we would expect. So what that shows is that the way to a solution for a comparatively simple problem, what seems a simple problem, is via a very large model. And if this is true of language, I'm pretty sure it's going to be true of other complex domains.
So there's questions in the chat that are following on from this discussion. Two questions that I think we can take together. So one from Hotri and one from Lucy, asking about the accuracy of the generative models you have in mind here, Parashkev, and whether the error of the generative models are the same as the data it's trained on, or whether they can essentially, as you were suggesting at the end of your previous answer, whether there's going to be some emergent gains as the data set grows.
Well, I mean, obviously models are not magical. The only intelligence they can draw is from the data itself. I think the question is, if you say, is the error the same as the data? Well, it is. But what's quite striking is that given sufficient volume of data, it's possible for structure in the data to emerge that might not be obvious to another model. Of course, if there is a particular aspect where the data is completely wrong, then it's bound to propagate that error. That's inevitable with any model. The innovation here is the realization that there is greater benefit in having a very large model trained on very large, relatively unfiltered data than there is in trying to filter the data a priori and then using a smaller model. I suppose the deep reason for that might be that there might still be informative commonalities in relatively corrupted data that a model can learn, or that kind of model can learn, that you otherwise do not provide the opportunity for it to draw on.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Maybe I can ask a question that tries to cross-fertilize between your two talks. So, Anna, I'm wondering whether, having listened to what Parashkev was saying there, whether there's any similar efforts going on in the mental health app space to essentially create larger and larger data sets that can start answering some of the questions you were posing towards the end of your talk.
I think there are people who are trying to do this, not in the HCI space, but more in the, I guess, the health and machine learning space.
Mm-hmm.
But although I think there are just a lot of barriers that we currently have, not just in terms of the cost of those studies to gather that data, but also in thinking about the privacy of the people involved in those studies. And until we have a good way of solving that issue, I think it's going to be hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned at the very end that there was of your talk that there was a lack of investment in any kind of physiological monitoring, which I found an intriguing comment. And I was wondering, how do you see that playing into these apps? So is the idea there that there's something like on my Apple Watch that feeds into the momentary assessment of the mental health profile?
Absolutely. I mean, we have colleagues at UCL who, some time ago have done research looking at how we can use activity data as an indicator of either risk or someone's mental health state. So, are people, I guess, to put it in general terms, are people getting out and about?
Yep.
Or are they sat at home, and can that give us an indication of whether they're experiencing a depressive episode, for example?
Yep.
So that kind of research has been done a long time ago. It's the sort of thing that really could be put into these apps. It does, of course, raise issues over privacy and the idea of the app tracking where you are and what you're doing. And so there are definitely problems to solve. But I just think it's interesting to see that the commercial apps are not, they haven't developed in this direction to a great extent yet. And we've had the technology available for quite a while.
All right, fascinating stuff. So are there any other questions? I'll just leave it for a couple of seconds in case anyone wants to unmute and ask. No? Okay, well, I think then we're bang on 2 o'clock, so we can wrap up a little early. Thank you so much again, Anna and Parashkev, for these fascinating presentations, and thanks everyone for coming along to today's session.